Good morning. Thanks to everybody for coming out on this rainy day. Of course, if you looked at the weather, every single other day is sunny except for today. We did not plan it that way, but certainly appreciate your coming out. My name is Asha George. I'm one of the co-directors for the Blue Ribbon Study Panel for Biodefense, along with my co-director, Ellen Carlin. We'd certainly like to welcome you. Today's report is the result of a year's worth of effort, meetings and research and discussion, and we're very excited, as you can probably tell, for the report to be released and to discuss the findings and recommendations with you today. We're going to start with some short remarks from our institutional sponsors, Hudson Institute and Potomac Institute. So I will be introducing both of them in turn, and then I will ask for some opening remarks from our panel members, and then we'll open the floor to press for questions after we have a brief discussion up here. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ken Weinstein from Hudson Institute. He is the president and CEO there. And Hudson Institute graciously hosted our 4 major meetings this year and provided other invaluable support. Dr. Weinstein.
Yeah, thank you, Asha. It's really truly an honor to be here today for the release of the National Blueprint for Biodefense. And when Asha noted that this was the result of a year's worth of work, this really was a year's worth of hard work, and I really applaud the co-chairs, the commissioners, and the staff for significant deliberations, a set of very comprehensive hearings, and for examining the literature, and also for speaking to the major experts in the field. Now, we at Hudson Institute took part in this exercise, conceived of this exercise for a commission on biodefense. As part of our mission, we're dedicated to strong and engaged U.S. international leadership and partnership with our allies. Ever since 1961, we've been focused on enhancing U.S. national security through scenario-based policy work to highlight emerging threats and then to devise and recommend measures to mitigate those threats. In the early 1960s, this took the form of thinking the unthinkable and conceiving and promoting the idea of civil defense and working closely with the Kennedy administration during the Cuban Missile Crisis to talk about ways to possibly respond to the emerging threat. Continued in the 70s and 80s with work on ballistic missile defense and advising the Reagan administration closely on that, to work today on the second nuclear age, on the threat of radical Islam, Iran, and biodefense as well. I'm especially delighted that 2 longtime friends of Hudson Institute and 2 great Americans and great heroes, champions of Homeland Security, Joe Lieberman and Tom Ridge, co-chaired this commission and brought together a very distinguished panel from both sides of the political aisle. This is not a partisan issue, it's a challenge. The challenge of biodefense is something that we as a nation need to take much more seriously. So this is, and I think the report really does go a long way to urging very critical measures that the country needs to take very seriously. I'm also delighted that the report has drawn on the expertise of a number of my colleagues from Hudson Institute. Scooter Libby, who played a critical role in biodefense in both the Bush 41 and 43 efforts, including being a linchpin for Operation BioShield. Tevi Troy, the former Deputy Secretary of HHS, who worked on implementing Project BioShield and worked on mitigating the challenge of avian flu, and Mike Rogers, the former chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Especially also want to thank Dr. Asha George and Dr. Ellen Carlin for their hard work and for the hard work of the staff that did so much preparation for the report. I also want to thank Dr. Bob Kadlec, who is the founding director of this project, for working on it before he returned to work in the U.S. Senate. And lastly, I want to thank our friends at the Potomac Institute for their partnership. But this is a very important report, and we're really honored to have the 3 of you distinguished gentlemen up here today to tell us what's in here and hopefully get these measures implemented. Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to have General Al Gray, Chairman of the Board of Regents at Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Say a few words. Potomac Institute in general and the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, headed by Dr. Yona Alexander, another one of our ex officios, also provided great support and expertise to our efforts.
Yeah.
Sir.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I want to echo the comments of our distinguished colleague from Hudson Institute. And Potomac Institute would like to add their super well done. Although I personally, as the chairman of the Board of Regents, I'm a little bit harder market. So I graded your work adequate and all of that. And that's, for those of you who don't know me, that's like a Legion of Merit in the other services. So I want to say that about 23 or 24 years ago, when I had the opportunity, I had already retired, but I had the opportunity to talk many times with then first the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and then later the Secretary of the Navy, Mr. Danzig, the Honorable Mr. Danzig, and he was very much interested in getting the military involved and doing something about this whole biodefense business. And it was around that time when your Marine Corps was the first unit to step forward, really, and start the Chemical Biological Incident Response Group to study this problem. They were later designated a national asset and the like, and of course they're still operable down out of a nearby location. And so this interest goes way back for all of us, and you all, more qualified really to talk about the overall threat than I am. I simply want to say that we have to remember that it's not just biological, it's not just chemical, it's not just weapons of mass destruction. It's the possibility in the dirty bomb, and it's the possibility of a combination of all three, plus cyber. And so the threats are really enormous, they're immense, and although you have to really analyze them individually, those threats and the like, to really get to the bottom of what we have to do, but we have to remember it's a collective challenge. And it certainly, the report that we're going to hear about today and pointing out the need for strong leadership at the highest of places and the like is right on. And so we at Potomac Institute for Policy Studies have long been interested in weapons of mass destruction and terrorism and in biological warfare and the like. We put out many studies ourselves, the hot zone and things of that nature and the like. So this really, for us, it's been a tremendous privilege to be a little bit of a part of this. And of course, Yona is always available when it comes to trying to help our country. So thank you all very much for being here, and I look forward to a great presentation. Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce Senator Lieberman, whom you all are very familiar with. I could stand up here for an hour and give his background, but I think I'll just stand up here for a few seconds and just remind you that he was the chair of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, that he was a senior member for the Senate Armed Services Committee, and one of the things he's best known for, and that we were so excited to be able to take advantage of here, is his ability to get things done across party lines, no matter what that took and what that meant. We've certainly benefited, and ask him to come up and give a few words.
Thanks very much, Asha. I'm delighted to come to this day. I was thinking as I was listening to Ken and the General that, in what one of my former Senate colleagues called the afterlife, which means the time after you're in the Senate. Apparently it's real. In this afterlife, you get approached to do many interesting things, and to a certain extent I've developed a kind of, not cynicism, but skepticism. I want to make sure that this is something that is real and can produce something that is constructive. And I must say that I'm very proud to be associated with this national blueprint. We worked hard together. We learned a lot. I certainly did. And I think in the end, this report is, Ken Weinstein and I used the same word, although you weren't in the room when I used it. It's tangible. It's quite comprehensive. It responds to the reality that we found, and it makes real recommendations for making things better. And I mean, the bottom line reality is that we think that the threat of biological attack is real and growing, and America's biodefenses are inadequate to the challenge. And I hate to have to say that, 14 years after 2001 and the anthrax attack so close by. But the report really talks about it, not in the mood of an attack, but in the mood of, I think, reporting our findings and then making constructive suggestions as to how to do things better. This didn't happen by accident. I thank Hudson and the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies for the backing that they gave us. Also, we had many foundations, coalitions, and companies that recognized the need for a study of this kind, and a special thanks to Dr. Asha George and Dr. Ellen Carlin for their remarkable leadership and informed leadership of this effort. And again, a pat on the back and gratitude to the founding staff director, Bob Cadlick. The panel was refreshingly small, but very high quality, 6 members, all with background in Homeland Security. Really wonderful to work with my dear friend Tom Ridge, who brings so much to the table as always, and he did here, former Secretary of Homeland Security, former member of the House, but still prefers to be known, as we learned in Connecticut politics, governor. That's the title. Donna Shalala could not be here, obviously former Secretary of HHS, very active in our deliberations, former Majority Leader Tom Daschle, former member of the House, Jim Greedwin, and Ken Weinstein, who is here and will talk. So why do we say the problem is real? I could go on at great length about that, but every day I think we face the real possibility of either an infectious disease outbreak. Remember, we're not just talking about a terrorist attack, an intentional bioterror attack, or the accidental release of a pathogen from a research facility. And why do I say that? I mean, just to do it as briefly and directly as I can, naturally occurring biothreats such as Ebola, which we saw just last year, are bypassing borders to come to America. Terrorist groups like the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant are taking brutality and terror to whole new levels, and biological warfare just fits in that sense directly into their mode of operating. And not surprising that ISIL has, if I can put it this way, embraced the prospect of committing biological warfare and threatened to use it to attack the American homeland. Man-made threats are also occurring here at home in the form of safety and security lapses in our nation's laboratories with agents like anthrax. So let me talk about the report. And let me go to the Ebola crisis, just to say briefly the extent to which, after all these years, we've done a lot, we've spent a lot, as much as, by one estimate, $6 billion a year on biodefense, and yet we're not anywhere near where our panel thinks we should be. Ebola had been designated as a material threat to our country for nearly a decade before last year. But we didn't have a single rapid diagnostic vaccine or treatment available, and the truth is we still don't. The response to Ebola, as I'm sure you'll all remember, was unacceptable. Even with 10 months of warning while the virus spread overseas, federal agencies did not provide hospitals with the basic guidance they need to manage an Ebola case. And we remember the sort of what seemed like the uncertainty in leadership during that crisis, and some human errors that were made. I mean, human error is always going to be a part of a governmental response, but here we had 10 months to prepare, and really that the human error that occurred was unacceptable. The next outbreak will probably not give us 10 months warning and is far more likely to be much more communicable. So I said at the outset that I learned a lot in our work on this panel, and I want to focus in. I mean, the report is tangible. I intentionally don't use the word wonkish because I think it's real. And there are 33 recommendations and about 100 action items. But I want to focus in on one as an example of what we found, because it was something I knew about, and yet it struck me. I just learned a lot, and that is about really this conclusion that the divisions between human and animal health are artificial, that most pathogens of concern affect both humans and animals. And in fact, among the bioterror threats for which the Department of Homeland Security has issued a material threat determination, all except one, smallpox, are zoonotic. I was the one at the panel who had to ask, what does zoonotic mean? And I now know it means that they reach human beings through animals. The same is true of emerging infectious diseases. By one estimate, I saw a credible estimate, 60% of which enter the human population via animals. So it was therefore really disappointing for our panel to learn that our country does not have a nationally reportable list of diseases that are occurring in real time in domestic and wild animals comparable to the list like that exists for humans. Obviously, if you don't have that awareness nationally, you're not going to spot alarm signs that would lead you to act. Therefore, in recommendation 7 of our report, we urgently call for the establishment of such a list and the implementation of a system to report its contents quickly to relevant public and private authorities. I mean, we had another example last year, and I won't go into it in detail. You can ask about it, but avian flu, which killed almost 50 million birds. That is, 50 million birds had to be euthanized, essentially. We were lucky that that flu didn't cross over to the human population, but it did have significant economic consequences, cost taxpayers, by one estimate, almost $1 billion. It doubled the price of eggs, which affects people, obviously, on limited income. And the reality is, as the experts predict, that migrating wild birds will probably reintroduce avian flu virus this fall. There is now a conditionally approved vaccine. The Department of Agriculture, it's weighing its use. Obviously, we don't know for sure that the next virus will be the same or that it will not affect humans. And if it mutates, the new vaccine, unfortunately, may well not work. So bottom line, as an example, avian influenza, a disease now occurring in animals, birds, poultry, is not just a USDA problem. It's a U.S. problem, and we need a comprehensive national response to it. Okay, 33 recommendations, 100 action items, but I want to conclude these opening remarks by saying that in some sense, the most important recommendation we make is the first one, which is that a part of what's lacking in the system now, $6 billion a year, let's take that estimate over the last several years for biodefense. Why aren't we getting our money's worth? Because there's not strong centralized leadership. And we recommend, probably surprisingly to many, that we looked at all the alternatives. Do you want to give one of the existing departments that has some responsibility here the opportunity to oversee and drive the program? Do we want to create a new assistant to the National Security Advisor, or God forbid, another czar? But in the end, we thought those were all not good and not what we needed, and therefore we recommend that the president designate the vice president to be the coordinator, overseer of our biodefense effort, and give the vice president specific budgetary authority, the authority to develop a national strategy for biodefense, and really importantly, a unified biodefense budget, because the $6 billion number I'm using this year is thanks to the University of Pittsburgh program, because really, right now you can't get that number from a federal government budget. I suppose I could put it together, but it doesn't exist now. Bottom line, the fact is, and it's an unacceptable fact, that America is seriously underprepared for biological attacks by terrorists or from infectious disease pandemics. We think that our report really can help make us more prepared. There's a lot more to say about our findings, but I'm going to, as I used to say across the street, yield the floor to, but I'm going to allow Asha to introduce him to really a dear friend and a great public servant, Governor Tom Ridge. Thank you.
Well, it's as the senator already said, Governor Ridge was the governor in Pennsylvania for a number of years, and was also a member of the House of Representatives. But I have to tell you, when I signed on to help be one of the co-directors for this activity, it was important to me that I be able to relate in some way to our panel members. Governor Ridge was in Vietnam and was a U.S. Army member, as was I, not in Vietnam, a little bit later. And I appreciate that go get 'em, go Army attitude. So, Governor.
Thank you, Asha, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure to be here, a privilege, truth be told. You know, I think my friend and colleague, Senator Lieberman, said that once you leave public service, there are plenty of opportunities to keep your head and your heart in the game. It's a matter of choosing those opportunities around which you can hopefully build to make a real contribution. And I would say if you take a look at the background of the six primary, we're just privileged to co-chair this, but you take a look at the six individuals, you'll see that they've spent most of their lifetimes in public service, and we continue to do that in a very formal way, but a non-elected way, and I'm very privileged to be part of that. We continue to gush over Asha and Ellen and the staff, and it's very appropriate. If you read that report, you'll see that it is probative, it is constructive, it is it's the kind of thoughtful, pragmatic inquiry and system of recommendations that we think are absolutely critical. I mean, if the government's committed to providing the common defense and identifying multiple threats that are out there, and we're worried about the kinetic threat and the terrorist threat and the cyber threat. Well, we don't think that the biological threat and these pathogens have been elevated to the level of interest and commitment at the national level that they deserve to be. And so I want to thank them again. And I go back to that first time I ever met that whirling dervish, Bob Cadlick. I mean, I don't know, I don't think the guy sleeps at all. His DNA is committed to public service. He's been there for a long time, but he particularly has been the catalyst. I mean, Reggie Jackson with World Series time might have been the straw that stirs the drink in October, but Cadlick is the straw that has stirred our interest now, not for years, but for decades, because we started working right after the anthrax attack. So a lot of this credit goes to Bob Cadlick, which he richly deserves as well, though he won't take it. He's very, very modest about his involvement. Let me just follow up briefly. I think having a conversation might be even more informative and better for you. But the Senator pointed out the threat. Look, it's real. It's not like we can get ahead of it. It's ahead of us already. So let's put that on the table. Some of our best friends in the global community, like Iran, Syria, China, Russia, North Korea, we know they've got the capacity, dual use, and they're not just working on defensive weapons. You've got the threats from the terrorists, you've got the naturally emerging bio threat, so it's out there. And I believe that we've made well-intentioned efforts, particularly since the deaths and the crisis around anthrax. I can never forget that. I mean, you're right, I did love being Gov. 6 years, 9 months, and 5 days, but it was counting. President called me down, we're dealing with 9/11, and bingo, all of a sudden the anthrax attacks occur, and you know that it was real. People died. And everybody scrambled to figure out how to deal with it. Hospitals weren't prepared, first responders weren't prepared, and the list goes on and on. You're going to see some of the same concerns addressed here, and 15 years later, we're still not ready. I remember seeing, within months of being in the White House, before the department was ever formed, a list of pathogens we ought to be worried about. Ebola was one of the pathogens. 14 years ago, folks. Now, I don't care how well-intentioned we've been and how much money we've spent and how many other things have happened at the national level over the past 14 years, you can decide whether or not you thought the country's response to the Ebola crisis, General, inadequate. And that's on a curve. We're not only being critical, but the fact of the matter remains is that it is a reality that biodefense has not been a priority for the federal government. Although there have been many efforts to elevate the discussion. There have been 4 commissions since 9/11 that have discussed this, and they're mentioning them in that have elevated the notion, the concern of biothreat, but not a lot happened. Really good people, bipartisan folks. I know when Senator Lieberman and I talked about working together on this, one, it was a joy to be reconnected with somebody I've admired a great deal over the years, but 2, to be somebody who was interested as I was in getting things done. We said, all right, well, this can't just be another report. We know what the threat is. We need to amplify the threat. We need to educate maybe the public, but more importantly, the folks in Washington, D.C. about the threat. But we want to be part of we want action items. It's one thing to talk about it. What are we going to do about it? And if you take a look at that very comprehensive report, not a lot of recommendations cost a lot of new money, folks. We understand their budget constraints, but we don't think that money's been very well spent on an annual basis. And there's some department heads out there and agency heads are going to get a little anxious and maybe start whining. Well, your job isn't to whine. Your job is to help prepare this country. You know, let me give you, we listed, it's fabulous. Take a look at it. Take a look, this is back to the future for me. Take a look at the number of committees that have jurisdiction over biodefense. It is not as bad as the 108 that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security has to deal with, but it's pretty ugly. The staff very effectively identified, I think, 25 documents, public laws, treaties, executive orders, dealing with biodefense, some element of biodefense. They did a head count. There are 50 political appointees dealing with biodefense. So I got the laws, I got the jurisdictions, I got the committees, I got the subcommittees, I got political appointees. It's like you are all in an orchestra. You all have an assignment, but the sheet music in front of you is all different. And they got no conductor. So one of the reasons, and then at the top of this we may get to some of the other recommendations, is that we want to make the Vice President the individual responsible for overseeing this, is because there is no national strategy. There is no unified budget. Agencies and departments ask for dollars effectively to advance their interests, which is perfectly all right. That's the way this world works. But their interest as the agency department may not be in the broader national interest because we haven't set national biodefense priorities. One glaring example, and I don't want to be, people probably a little upset about this. We spent a ton of money on early research, basic research. And the folks at BARDA, they get like chump change, and they're the advanced research agency. So we want to move some money around, not to be critical of folks, but the money has to be moved around, and I have a particular desire and appreciation for the power of the vice presidency, because having been in the White House, I like the notion that the president has the vice president take this task on, and he meets the vice president, then works with OMB to move money around, consistent with a broader strategy, because one of the second recommendations was we have this Biodefense Coordination Council within the White House, comprised of people representing the public and the private sector and the academic community. I mean, this has got an integration. We need to integrate our capabilities, and you'll see some of these recommendations. And again, it's very much like Homeland Security trying to deal with terrorism. You can't secure the country from inside the Beltway for bioterrorist attacks. You need partners out there. You need the state and local level. You need to advance public health. You need to do certain things with the intelligence community. You need to do certain things. I mean, the list of recommendations, you'll find there's good. They're knit together. They're knit together. So you have the conductor of the orchestra, everybody reading off the same song sheet. The vice president takes a look with OMB and says, you know, it's nice they want that research, but those dollars assigned to that department are not consistent with the national strategy, not consistent with the priorities we've made, so we're shifting them. That's pretty powerful stuff. And we really think it's absolutely essential. And again, I think there's a lot of well-intentioned people who go on the Hill and in this town every day trying to do their part to help us deal with the reality of a biothreat. But it's just not working, folks. We're spending more and more money. There are more and more programs, more and more legislation, and we're less and less effective because we're more and more decentralized. No coordination, no communication, no budget, no strategy, nada. Classic example, well-intentioned people expanded the reach of government, and unfortunately in doing so became even less and less effective at trying to achieve the goals for which they signed on, because it's not coordinated. So I'm really very, very pleased to be with my colleagues here today, and I look forward to the conversation we're going to have with you. You know, I've been privileged to serve in government most of my life, and I'm glad I live in a democracy. I'm proud American. I think we're really a pretty exceptional place. But one of the challenges in this more complicated 21st century world, I believe, is that democracies, by and large, rarely act in a preemptive way. We're great at responding. Actually, we're not so great, particularly in the biodefense. We see we haven't done very well there either. But I mean, the point of it is that this document says to our friends on the Hill and to the country at large, the threat is real. Let's not wait for an attack to occur, whether it's a terrorist, a country, or Mother Nature. There are certain things that we need to do over the next several years because we can't get it done immediately. You're going to see some immediate short-term and long-term items and recommendations. But let's elevate our attention to it, and let's think for once, in a more preemptive rather than a reactive mode. And by the way, we also know that we can't create a fail-safe system either. That no matter how hard we try, no matter how much money we expend, how much applied research we do, no matter how many medical countermeasures we develop, something may happen, but we also obviously pay attention to response and recovery here as well, decontamination and remediation. But it's a good plan. And my colleagues and I on the panel, very pleased to have been part of it. And again, we go back to this very talented staff that did such monumental work to create this great blueprint for action. We've got to quit talking about it. It's time to be preemptive. And that's what I think we've done. Thank you.
So you know Ken Wainstein. He's the former Homeland Security Advisor. He was also the first Assistant Attorney General for National Security. But when we were looking at the panel and wondering who should come on to the panel, we thought it was important to have somebody who had dealt with a challenge or two in terms of working with other folks at high levels and who had a lot of energy. I think Ken, having been the chief of staff for the FBI, qualified him for the position more than probably anything else. And we hope he's enjoyed his time with us. I think his perspective is quite interesting and comes from a different place than the rest. Ken?
Okay, thank you very much, Asha. I guess with that energy comment, I'll have to do my best Ben Carson. So I got lots of energy. I have energy, or Jeb Bush. I'm, what is it, the Energizer Bunny. It's good to be here, but I can look out and see the disappointment in your eyes that when you heard that Ken Weinstein was coming up to the podium, that you weren't getting more Ken Weinstein of Hudson. You're just getting me. Sorry to disappoint. As you can imagine, Ken and I get each other's emails all the time. But this is the first time we've actually shared a stage together, and it's a real honor. He reminds me that the easy way to distinguish us is that he's the charming, good-looking Ken Weinstein, I'm the other one. But I do want to thank him, Hudson, and Potomac for their support on this effort. It's been absolutely critical, and I think it's borne results. What I'd like to do is, you've heard the sort of the what, how, why from Governor Ridge and Senator Lieberman. What I'd like to do is focus in specifically on the leadership issue, which you've heard about. As you heard, we have concluded that that biodefense just has not had the centralized leadership that it absolutely needs. And as a result, the whole enterprise has suffered from a sense of kind of a lack of urgency and a lack of the top-down driven coordination and collaboration that it needs if we're really going to tackle this problem. And as we say that, and as we sort of render that diagnosis, I think it's important to keep a few things in mind. First, it's not as though this is the fault of any particular administration or any particular set of government officials. Government officials in all administrations over the last few have made great strides in this area, but I think we recognize that the strides haven't gone far enough and haven't moved fast enough to get us where we need. And we all count ourselves among those officials who've worked at this issue, but we haven't tackled it. So this is a shared responsibility among all administrations, and frankly among both the legislative and the executive branches. Second thing to keep in mind is that there's some really good practical reasons why this has been a problem. This is not an easy issue. First, it's a complicated challenge that requires, sustained work on really complicated, thorny issues that extend from, the whole spectrum of activities, from detection to preparedness to response and recovery. And it's just a really tough set of issues to try to wrestle the ground. Secondly, as you've heard, it requires the coordination of countless different federal agencies, all of whom have a stake in this. As Governor Ridge said, coordination of 50 different political appointees, which is a challenge in and of itself, and also the coordination of state and local partners and industry, all of whom play an important part of this and all of whose activities need to be coordinated. And I think the third, sort of the most important factor to keep in mind is that this is a matter where the American people have not come to recognize the urgency of the threat. They don't get it that that the threat is immediate and that strong actions are needed. And part of that is because, we haven't had a 9/11, a bio 9/11. In a traditional kinetic terrorism context, we had 9/11, and that was a wake-up call. And that drove the government and actually the whole, and the American people to develop the counterterrorism apparatus that protects us today. Fortunately, we haven't had the bio 9/11, but the downside of that is that we haven't had the wake-up call that we need, and as a result, I think we as a nation fail to recognize both the urgency of the threat as well as the need for strong and decisive action. And I think another thing to keep in mind is that this is not the first time we've seen this movie. We've seen this situation before, and we've seen the consequences of this situation before. And as an analogy, I think we can just look back over the last decade or two and look at the cyber threat and how the cyber threat was and was not handled. This is exactly what happened in the cyber context, and I know I was there, I had a front row seat to this. We had a complex issue really complex with a lot of thorny issues. We had numerous logistical, operational, legal, and even diplomatic challenges that had to be wrestled down. We had numerous players, both within government and outside of government, who had to be coordinated and whose activities needed to be aligned. And also, this is a situation where, just like this, we didn't truly recognize the dimensions of the threat and didn't truly recognize it as a country until we started suffering the devastating incursions that our government and our private systems have suffered over the last 5 to 6 years. So we on the panel are concerned that that not happen in this situation, and that we take whatever steps are necessary to prevent that happening in the bio context. And that's why we focus in our report and in our comments today on the need for centralized leadership in the federal government. And the vice president idea, the idea that this responsibility for centralized leadership be housed in the office of the vice president, that's just one way to do it, and there certainly might be others. We think it's a very strong answer. We think it actually is a viable, very viable concept, but there are others as well. The bottom line is that sustained, centralized, action-driving leadership is needed, and it's needed now. And it's our hope that this report will help the American people to recognize that and help encourage the policymakers of our government to take the steps that are necessary to provide that leadership. Thanks very much, and thanks to the panel and to Asha and Ellen for all their great work and for including me in this. Take care.
So before I ask the panel members here a few questions, I did want to just make sure that you are aware that we are missing 3 panel members here today. Former Secretary of Health and Human Services Donna Shalala could not be here, obviously. Former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, for whom this is a very personal issue, and former Representative Jim Greenwood. These are people who care a lot about the issue for very interesting and specific reasons. But we thank them for their input and their help. And they are available to you to follow up with. We also want to thank our ex officios, a number of whom are here today. We appreciate your input and subject matter expertise. One of the recommendations for the entire panel to comment on is that we are calling to have the Vice President of the United States take charge of national biodefense. You've all been in leadership positions before, and if you were the vice president and you decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and take this up. From your perspectives, what steps would you take other than following, line by line everything in our report today? Senator.
Good question. So. The first thing I would do is to figure out where everybody is, where the pieces are, and then try to figure out where the money's going. And we do call for a national biodefense strategy that the Vice President would oversee. A critical part of this is to have everybody involved in this area know that there's one person, the Vice President, who they are accountable to, and they got to work together. There's still, as Governor Ritz said, there's still some of the silo nonsense going on that we found, the 9/11 Commission found, particularly after the attacks of 9/11. Still some of that going on here where it is just inexcusable, and it needs somebody from up above to drive it. And then the critical part, ongoing, is a unified budget, that the Vice President knows this is how much money America is spending on biodefense, and hopefully we'll be able to advise the President, OMB, that, you know what, we're spending too much here. We got to move it over here. Or we're spending not enough here, and we got to give them a little more money because it's critical to our defense. So this is, we talked a lot about this. You could give a lot of problems to the Vice President, but we came to the conclusion, it's a little bit like what the Graham Talent Commission did earlier, that it's, this seems, the threat of a biological attack by terrorists seems so real and manageable more than other, for instance, a nuclear attack on our homeland, that thank God it hasn't happened yet, but we're really lucky that it hasn't. And there's an urgency to getting this organized, and again, the Vice President, to us, seemed to be the unusual, but in some sense inevitable new leader for this effort, and that's why we hope the President will listen to what we have to say.
Governor?
Just ever so briefly, I think one of the advantages of having that coordination council as assigned to the Vice President being part of the White House staff is that they have the ability, first of all, to identify the redundancy, to use the tools of inquiry available to the White House, whether it's GAO or elsewhere, to see where the money has gone, to see how effectively it's been spent. I mean, there's a lot of overlap here, because I think one of the critical pieces of this architecture, and the reason we've given the Vice President the responsibility writ large to write the sheet music and then conduct the music, is that when he points to this area of the orchestra and said, "That's enough. You calm down a little bit. We're gonna go over to this area. We need to elevate your profile in this session." In this town, the only way you influence people's conduct is if you have access to the dollars. I mean, trust me, Special Assistant to the Vice President, you may have a nice office located across from the Oval Office. You may have opportunity to use the Roosevelt Room to convince and proselytize and everything, and you know about this, but you don't have the opportunity to say, we're shifting some of the resources that you had last year over here because this is a much higher priority today for this country than what you're doing. And frankly, I think there's only two people that can get that done. The President's going to be pretty busy working on other things. You got the Vice President working with OMB. Of course, you're going to have to fight the hill. Listen, I've been a member of Congress before, and I know what's going to happen because all the agencies will go running behind the Vice President into the hill and say, well, the Vice President's well-intended, but that strategy, they really don't understand our needs and all that nonsense. And then I think the Vice President picked up the phone and said, we understand it very well. We've been studying it for the past year and a half. They don't need that money. The other agency does, and the administration expects you to fund it accordingly. I mean, there's still going to be a lot of give and take in this. We really need that centerpiece, that strong, aggressive leadership. And by the way, that plan that we want has to be, it's got to be comprehensive, but it'll probably change depending on intelligence, depending on what else is going on, and other things that we develop in this plan that gives the country and the Vice President more and more information over the years. But we appointed a czar after Ebola. We do have an assistant secretary for preparedness and response in HHS. Good people, they have a slice of biodefense, and they really don't have the political muscularity to get things done. And that's why we think the only place to take this is keep it in the executive branch, but it's not a czar, it's not an assistant secretary. By the way, we need the assistant secretary, but isn't that interesting? It's for preparedness and response. And there's so much more to this complicated puzzle about being prepared than those very important details, but there are a few details in a sea of many.
Sir.
Thanks. Just to add to that, what you heard from Senator Lieberman and Governor Rich, when you think about this question of whether we should put this responsibility in the White House and specifically in the hands of the Vice President, one question is, well, it seems like you make a case for doing it here with this threat, but then there are a bunch of other threats out there, and should we be doing this with every threat, such that the Vice President is going to be, the czar of all these threats? Does that make sense? Well, we think, and we thought that through, that was a real consideration. We think this situation is unique in a couple ways. One, as Senator Lieberman said, the seriousness of the threat and the possible consequences of us not getting this right. What could happen, to the United States and to its people. But secondly, it's what I mentioned earlier in my remarks, which is the complex nature of this, how complicated it is, and how many players within the federal government need to be heavily involved in this. I mean, you think about it, you read the report, you'll see a big piece of this is DOD and defense. A big piece of this is HHS and the whole health community. A big piece of this is the Justice Department and investigative assets. So it's it's sort of hard to think of another national security threat or national security program that requires the same extent of coordination that this does. And that's why we think it calls for centralized coordination in the White House. And Governor Ridge and I both spent time overseeing the interagency process in the Homeland Security area in the White House, and I think it's pretty effective in a lot of ways. But the National Security Advisor and the Deputy National Security Advisor now, they have got a lot on their plate, and it's difficult to really highlight a threat like this among all the other threats that they're dealing with. That's why we think it's better to go ahead and take it out of that, not take it out of the process, but take that process, give it the responsibility to the Vice President who's got the authority to actually make things happen, and then push through this council that we're recommending that get established and down to the agencies. We think that that's the answer.
If I might add real quickly, the President chose to integrate the Homeland Security staff and the National Security staff. All right, that's the President's prerogative. I personally thought it was a bad idea, but the President proceeded as he felt he should. And there was supposed to be a WMD coordinator in the National Security staff. I don't think that person exists. And even if that person exists as one member of the National Security team, that person has had no traction. It's not going to talk to CDC or NIH or DHS or Agriculture or DOD. I mean, that's just not going to happen. As well-intentioned and as armed, I'm a member of the National Security Council, that's going to happen. And I think this coordination activity among secretaries particularly is precisely the role that the person who can effectively herd the group and set priorities and direct funding streams is the Vice President.
Should we go ahead and? Yes, okay, so we'll go ahead and open the floor to the press. Questions? Ma'am?
I had a question for Secretary Ridge, Governor Ridge.
Whatever.
You had suggested that, oh, thank you.
You're
You had suggested that that there was too much being spent on basic research and that more needs to be put toward BARDA. So do you think that that the efforts that went in, the early efforts that went into the Ebola vaccine were maybe not necessary? Because I know that that was, Dr. Fauci has really credited all of that effort that they put into that basic research early on and pursuing that path was what led them to where they are now with, potential vaccine available soon.
Well, first of all, I have enormous regard for Dr. Fauci. But let me just say this, that I think this is an agency that's over 100 years old. It was the agency that was supposed to coordinate all the bioactivity within the federal government. I think to that extent it has, it's too big a job for it. This agency is part of that. It can't oversee because the infrastructure is too large. I'm grateful that they had done some basic research at Ebola, but I must tell you, and I'm not a scientist, I saw Ebola on the list in 2001. It's difficult for me to believe that had there been a focus on an antidote, on a medical countermeasure, employing not only NIH, but BARDA and the private sector, that it would have taken us 15 years to find one. I mean, this is an urgent problem, and we don't have time to waste. So I appreciate the value. I appreciate the value of this basic research. But we need a sense of urgency, and you can't be, and we need to set, somebody has to set priorities, and that's why we think it's a national strategy, and that strategy is based on intelligence. We want to beef up the intelligence gathering capabilities so that the decision makers, including people like the head of NIH and BARD and everybody else, we all know where the dollars are going consistent with the needs at the time. So I applaud them. I'm glad they got it. But frankly, you never convinced me that had there been a different structure and more pointed integration and effectiveness between NIH, BARDA, and the private sector would have taken us so long to come up with an antidote.
To follow up, are you saying that some of the funds that go to NIH should be taken from NIH and given to BARDA, or should it be?
Well, I think some of the funds going to NIH should be spent not on what NIH wants, but they ought to be spent on what the Vice President and the coordinating, and the team says they have to be spent on. I mean, I think there's a big difference. I mean, listen, I appreciate NIH is just like Homeland Security, like AG, any other department or agency of federal government. They set their priorities internally. That's good. That's important. But one of the reasons we think those dollars would be more effectively spent if those priorities were set consistent with a national plan, not just an institutional or agency plan. So maybe the direction is you use some of those basic research dollars on these programs. And frankly, we think some of the money should be shifted. These are tight fiscal times. We did not design a report where we're necessarily going to throw billions and billions of dollars at it. Maybe the Congress will do that. But if some of those dollars are shifted for the time being, so be it. It's not the interest of NIH that's. They're not setting the agenda. The vice president and the coordinating group will set the agenda.
Other questions? Well, one of the questions that came to me earlier, sir, had to do with the multiplicative threat that General Gray and others have brought up. And in particular, one of the issues that we addressed in the report was the interaction between the cyber threat and the biological threat. So, Governor, if you could talk just a little bit about that and the concerns we have about the cyber threat breaching data, pathogen data, and what those implications are. Governor.
Oh, no, I think, again, this is one of the, I would use this as an example to show you how thoughtful our work was over the past year. I mean, you worry about the threat of terrorism, you worry about cyber threats, but this capability to access intellectual property, there's a lot of information out there. Some of it's in universities, some of it's at national labs. And so as you take a look at the challenges associated with living in an interconnected world, interdependent world, the connection between cyber vulnerability and the information that would be available and the science now that's available to genetically modify some of these pathogens, a lot of that's just available on the internet. And so we, again, as we take a look at those institutions and agencies that are part of the Biodefense platform, we want them to be absolutely certain they've done everything they can to insulate. Again, you're going to manage the risk, but do everything they can with contemporary, with software and with procedures to minimize the exfiltration of that information.
I just add really briefly that there's been an outbreak of accomplishment on the Hill in the last 24 hours, which you may not have noticed. The imminent two-year budget agreement is really, now, it's not perfect, but it's really stunning, thank God. But the other reason I lead this, and maybe lost, is the fact that apparently moving through Congress now, and presumably going to be signed by the President, is an information sharing bill regarding cyber data, which is really critical in every area. Susan Collins and I just banged our heads against the wall to get this as part of a comprehensive cyber defense bill, which never could pass. But here they got together on, because I think the threat is real. And this will help in this area. This will enable companies that are dealing with pathogens and information about pathogens to share the information with the government and not worry about liability for doing that. So there's a little bit of hopeful news from across the street, notwithstanding the fact that I'm not there anymore.
Well, one of the challenges with information sharing is, we're talking about a multifaceted threat. Naturally occurring diseases, accidentally released diseases, intentionally introduced diseases, and obviously part of the information we have there is not just scientific and open to everybody. Part of it comes from the intelligence community. So we have challenges there. Could you talk a little bit about how we can overcome the natural inclination of the intelligence community and the law enforcement community to hold that sensitive information close and get more of it out to the state and local folks and the private sector, for that matter, to help defend against this.
Sure, this is not a new issue at all. The issue being the need to make sure that all the players who have a role in a national security effort can get the necessary information. I mean, I just know from firsthand experience after 9/11, that was a big concern because you had most of the relevant information about the foreign terrorist threat naturally being in the hands of the intelligence community and the FBI. You had concerns about terrorist cells, foreign terrorist cells here in the United States, and the first line of defense against those terrorist cells, naturally, are state and locals. But you had the situation where major police departments would have maybe one person who had the clearance to get the information that they needed. Police chiefs in major cities didn't even have those clearances. So that's just an example of how this is an enduring problem. And there are logistical issues like clearances, and then there are cultural issues. And those cultural issues have to be surmounted as well. And I think we've come a long way since 9/11. I can tell you that whether it's between law enforcement community, particularly the FBI, and the intelligence community, we've come light years in terms of sharing information. We've come light years in terms of sharing information with state and locals, but there's still a long way to go. Here, in this particular situation, you now introduce other players who maybe haven't already kind of come around to this information sharing approach because this has different dimensions than the traditional kinetic terrorist threat that we dealt with post 9/11. And so I think there's really got to be a focus on information sharing. At the same time, there's always, you hear from a lawyer, there's always a on the other hand. But at the same time, we've got to be careful with that information because, as Asha said, some of this is about pathogens that can be used by adversaries. And just as we've seen with major leaks of national security information, over the last few years, we've got to be very careful that while we do broaden information sharing to the necessary players, we do so in a way that is protected.
If I might add on that, if you look at the report, we took a look at DHS, and DHS was supposed to be theoretically the depository of bioinformation from the other agencies. There's a bioterrorism protocol there. Refresh my recollection. What's the...
It's the National Biosurveillance Integration
the
System.
and the notion that you would have all the other departments sharing information with DHS, and it's still very difficult 14 years after anthrax and after 4 commissions to have people in the other agencies hit the send button to send the information for DHS. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me. I mean, I understand institutional turf, and I understand, you mentioned something there, Ken, I think is really very appropriate. There's this culture. But we're no longer in a need-to-know culture. That was Cold War stuff. We're in need-to-know culture. And the need to know is whether it's the terrorist information, bioinformation, whatever it is, because you can't secure the country from inside the Beltway. And you got your partners out there in the public sector and the private sector that want to be part of that. And so we were going to ask one of our reporters, again, a lot of good people doing a lot of good things here. But we want, as part of this report, you'll see a recommendation, and we want DHS or somebody to take a look at this and see if it's not working, fix it, and if you can't fix it, let's go to another system. But it's about time we started sharing that information.
Questions? Sir?
Asha, there's a great section in the report about the intersection of innovative approaches and bureaucratic processes. It seems that every time we have an issue where there's risk, government creates more bureaucratic processes to mitigate that risk. And yet, bureaucracy doesn't move at the speed of innovation. Can y'all expound on what's in the report and what the recommendations are in that respect?
Go ahead, Asha.
Well, let me just start with it. You know, we want to make BARDA really empower them to take the lead in this innovative effort. We want them to have contracting authority. We want the private sector to be involved as part of that. the coordination council within the White House, and I don't want to hear people, we're going to need people from the industry to help set priorities and understand that the vice president will be able to sort through, and they're going to bring a certain perspective and mindset. But right now, it's we better start thinking differently about how we incentivize the private sector, because some of these medical countermeasures will end up in the national stockpile. There's no real market for them because it's not like you're going to go to your pharmacy and get them off the shelf. We need to be, if it were to be preemptive, and so that means there has to be different incentives, and because your customer will be the federal government, and you hope that all those good works end up and you never have to use them. So we have to think differently about incentives. We have to think differently about who's got contracting authority. And frankly, we just think BARDA should have much greater authority in encouraging innovation and directing some of these contracts and working more collaboratively with the private sector.
This is a real problem. Chuck Ludlam is here. Chuck worked with me in the Senate. It was a couple of months after 9/11 that we started to talk about how we could incentivize the pharmaceutical industry to get involved in medical countermeasures, because it was clear we weren't benefiting from the extraordinary innovative capacity of the industry. Why? Because there was very high risk in getting involved in this area, and the market wasn't rewarding it, and the shareholders would not quite understand. So Chuck came up with a brilliant, logical idea, which is that we should say that if you had a proposal for a medical countermeasure and it received a sort of threshold level approval from the Secretary of HHS, then a big pharma company, then you could choose to take one of the drugs, your main drugs, and extend the patent life for a year or two. What a great incentive. The generic drug companies didn't view it that way. And they came over the horizon like the cavalry and it just killed it in Congress. And we're still looking for ways to engage the private sector, because we're not doing this quickly enough, and lives are obviously on the line. Yes.
Go ahead.
Another question. On a follow-up on that, with something like what's already set up with the FDA, the incentive they have, the vouchers that the companies can earn for developing pediatric drugs or the tropical disease drugs, and then they can either take that voucher and use it themselves to quicken one of their own drugs through the regulatory process, or they can sell it and have been sold for like $350 million. So would something like that?
Yeah, that's a good model. We looked at that, and that's one model for creating the same kind of incentive.
Yes.
Asha, really, you're an expert in this, so I invite you to speak.
I think we're talking about common sense solutions now. We say that industry and the private sector has to be involved, but then we don't set up a process for their involvement. We say, oh, we have to generate incentives, but then we never ask them what would actually incentivize them to do anything. We're just making up stuff and hoping. It's just not, it's not common sense. And again, in terms of innovation, it's not just about industry, although we love industry. But other departments and agencies, for example, right, are moving forward on things. An example would be biodetection. DOD is working on biodetection. It's not like they ever stopped. But there are no mechanisms, no good mechanisms in place to get their innovative efforts from one department transferred over and looked at and applied by another department, like the Department of Homeland Security, as it develops its BioWatch detectors. So what do we see? We see innovation decreasing in one department, increasing in another, and then we see a lot of waste, and the answer to that is bureaucracy. Well, there's just no, either there are too many steps in between, or there are no steps and nobody can step off and get that needed information. So that is part, really, and I think it's the foundation of everything we're talking about. If we're going to come up with innovative solutions, we have to make sure that we're taking a common sense approach and get everybody to the table.
This is a really good example. I was thinking about that when you asked your question, because the problem is the one we talked about, which is how does government encourage people in the private sector to take risk? But the other problem, and the BioWatch is an example of it. I mean, there's so much real and practical in the report that I think you sort of want to take pieces of it and put it in a spotlight. Is inertia. The other problem is inertia within the government. So, in my opinion, and I think the panels generally, the BioWatch program at the Department of Homeland Security is using technology that is way outdated and is just not very effective in the critical role that we assign, which is essentially to give us an early warning about biological pathogens in the atmosphere. So we got to, and I believe that Secretary Johnson himself has expressed some skepticism or concern about how that program is doing. It's just gone on too long the way it was, and it's not working anymore. And so either we got to fix it or we got to close it and try some newer technology, which you can probably, I use the metaphor, buy off the shelf. It would be a lot better than what's out there now.
Okay, a couple more questions? Anybody else? Okay.
Sorry, nobody else. Going back to what you were saying about the pharmaceutical and the incentives, when you had Jim Greenwood helping you author this, so what did you hear from him? What were the incentives? I mean, he was right there with you. Were you asking the industry then what would get them going on this? More than just, because right now it's just the little biotech companies, and what happened with Ebola was a lot of them jumped right in, and some of the big pharmas jumped right in, and a few months down the road, they were all taking their drugs and going elsewhere with them.
Go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say was, as much as I love our panel members, instead of trying to make them remember from rote what we wrote in the report, I would recommend that you read the section in the report for the very, very specific recommendations we make. But, Governor?
You know, I was also going to say, Jim made those recommendations, but again, if the President and the Congress are willing to adapt this blueprint, and we have the interaction that we think is absolutely critical to not only elevating the issue, but actually dealing with the issue of biodefense, we as a panelist, there are some specific recommendations in this, but there are probably a lot more to be considered and from a broader list to be selected. It is absolutely imperative to understand that a lot of these medical countermeasures, the only market will be the federal government. And basically you're building an emergency supply of medical countermeasures that you hope you'll never use. And so there's no public market for it, so we just really have to take a look at what the big pharma, perhaps, a lot of innovation going on in these small companies. Frankly, they're a lot more innovative. Frankly, the big boys the little companies are innovative and the big boys gobble them up. And that alchemy is okay, that's chemistry, that's the market, but I think we're going to let those kinds of options and those opportunities be created by the council inside the Vice President's office. I mean, there's some ideas in there, but we don't have the monopoly on giving the best ideas. Just they seem to be appropriate right now for us, but it's got to change all the time.
Okay, so I'm just going to allow...
One more?
No, oh, sure. Somebody else? Oh, yes.
Hi, Amanda Arnold with Arizona State University. Thank you so much for this. My question for you is, it doesn't sound like this group is going to let this report sit on a shelf somewhere and grab dust. So what are your thoughts on some sort of implementation? I know you're already giving your time to speak to Congress at various different hearings. What is the sort of the long-term implementation plan that we can all start thinking about as you are sort of fueling the conversation, especially on the Hill?
Well, I'll start. You're right. I mean, as we all said earlier, we got into this because all of the six of us have had a background in Homeland Security, and we were concerned that our biodefenses, our national biodefenses, were not what we need them to be. I think we end this process with this report today documenting that in fact our concerns were perhaps even underestimated, and the status quo in biodefense is way below the level of the threat. So we don't know what the form will take, but we're all committed not to sort of deposit this and walk away. And we particularly want to continue to see if we can engage Dr. Usher, Dr. George, and Dr. Carlin in this, and ourselves. We care about it enough that it would be, in some sense, irresponsible to just walk away. So we're probably going to see if we can get some funding to keep this going. And the aim will be to be advocates for what we're recommending. Obviously, it would be great if somebody in the executive branch takes hold of this, and some people on Capitol Hill take hold of this and run with it. But even if that happens, it needs this informed group, and really bipartisan group, to continue to be advocates for it, and we will.
Well said. Stay tuned.
Final words, Governor or Ken? No? Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for being here.
Appreciate your interest and your questions. And we look forward to working with you as we implement. Thank you.